Welcome to the Beyond the Commit pod. Today I'm joined by Jared Green in what is a two-part conversation. Jared is a long-time developer productivity leader, previously at Microsoft and LinkedIn, and now founder of the AI startup Altar. In this episode, we go beyond the usual buzzwords and dig into what developer experience really means. The tension between freedom and standardization, why treating engineers like artists actually matters, and how metrics, perception, and nuance all collide in a real engineering organization. I hope you'll enjoy the conversation at least as much as I did. Let's jump right in.
Every executive I've ever worked with is like always like, can you just give me one number to look at?
Yeah.
And you're like, can we just have some way to make that part of it? And it becomes a really challenging thing to think about because generally extensibility is the enemy of consistency, right? Because you end up having to build all these extension points that let people use different tool chains, and then suddenly you now have a huge giant level of differences.
Finally, the conference about this particular topic, and today you go anywhere, and it's probably in San Francisco. You've got like few of those conferences every year.
I think often happens is it's very easy to think of this as one unit of people, right? The developers. The way a systems engineer works versus someone who's a front-end engineer or an infra, they're very diverse. The tool chains they use, the technologies they use are very different. The things they care about are very different.
So the team doesn't have any significant benefit. They just need to migrate. And they might need to migrate like third time, for instance, because the company decided already third time that we are jumping to yet another cloud because, I don't know, the CTO has changed.
We also wildly underestimate these kind of efforts to standardize. People are like, oh yeah, we can just move to this on a Tuesday. And then it's like 3 years later and we're like, hey, we still haven't moved, a third of the cover.
Yeah.
When they come in to build something, they want to feel like the tools they're using are the best in the industry to produce the most amazing piece of art to really express themselves in a meaningful way.
All right, so we are up. My name is Pavel Dolega and I am CTO at Virtus Lab, and today with me is Jared Green. Hi, Jared.
I'm Jared Green. I'm the CEO at a new AI startup called Altar currently. I have a long history in the developer experience, developer productivity space. I ran developer productivity and happiness at LinkedIn as a VP. I was at Microsoft for about 22 years. Started there as an intern working on file systems. And then I found my way into this world of developer productivity because apparently I wrote tools that helped other developers that slowly became more and more needed. And I ended up running the engineering system for all of Windows, Xbox, Windows Phone, MSN, which was supporting 14,000 engineers on a day-to-day basis. But really, I've spent most of my career either working in low-level code, kernel stuff, or build, test systems that scale for large companies. And most recently, I've left LinkedIn to pursue a startup really around thinking about what productivity is going to look like in this new world of AI and how it's transforming things. And a lot of the things I saw happening at LinkedIn and at Microsoft are really being changed. And so that's what I'm working on now.
Marvelous. Marvelous, and thank you for this introduction. And today we wanted to talk about a few things, and one of them being the big part of it being the development experience. And then, of course, in this day and age, it's difficult to talk about it or to talk about any subject really without at least talking a little bit about the AI. So why don't we start just from that and development productivity. So you mentioned really the wealth of experience that you had throughout your career, and a big chunk of it, as you said, was the development productivity, development experience. Could you tell us a little bit, because it's a development experience and productivity is a really broad topic. What are for you the sort of key aspects of developers' productivity?
Yeah, I think You know, over time it's changed. I think at one point it was really just a simple thing of like, hey, how do I make, how do I automate myself? There's this notion that I've always had of like engineers are lazy in general. And so how do you make them lazier? Like they want to do less work. And so the best engineers are often the laziest engineers who like will automate themselves out of work. And so I think a lot of where dev productivity started was like, how do you take these tasks that you sort of have to do? I have to like build all this code, then I have to test it, I have to do all these tasks. And really, it's not the fun part of like designing, architecting. And so I think a lot of it, early on was really about like, how do you kind of orchestrate that in a way that makes it more consistent? And then there's sort of another problem that started to appear. I think that when I think about dev productivity, like we start to think, early on, it's like when you're a small company and there's four people, you can do anything. But as the company grows, there's this like all notion of an engineer, and like they're very artistic and they want to do everything the way they want to do it. But if you have three engineers who decide they want to do it their way and the other one decides that they want to do it their way, I mean, can you imagine building bridges like this? Where like one says, well,
Yeah.
I want to use cement, and the other one says, I want to use wood, and then like you have a really messed up product. And so because of the sort of freedom that we engineers have with all the software tools, dev productivity also emerged as sort of a convergence or conformance of allowing people to work together using different approaches, but making sure that they're not sort of violating core things. So there's sort of a convergence of two things. There's like a corporate interest, which is how do we make sure we get a good product that's consistent, that's has sort of practices and work that goes on. And then there's like, how do you unbound people's productivity still within that? So there's sort of this, that a lot of companies I think experienced early on in the 80s and the 90s, which was they started to realize we can't just let everyone do whatever they want to do. We're going to big pile of mess. And then once they did that, though, their engineers were really unhappy. They were
Hmm.
really frustrated and angry because they're like, hey, I can't do what I want to do. So I think the last 20 years of developer productivity has been about how do we really give people a great experience when they're building software at large companies, but without sort of, hampering their creativity and their ability to do and work the way they want. So there's been always this friction between conformity and
Hmm.
freedom that's emerged. And really, what I see in dev productivity is sort of this like, how do you enable both? How do you make an engineer feel and have delight that they're able to be truly, project what's in their head into a computer and create something without sort of like, creating enough rules and restrictions. And I think that's, in this new AI age, that problem is actually, an order of magnitude more difficult, right? Because suddenly now people can produce, code that would have taken them months, weeks, they can do in a day, right? So now we're seeing a whole new set of things that these old systems really couldn't really even imagine. So it's sort of, when I think about it though, I think about like sort of dev productivity. It's about really how do you make every engineer feel like when they come in, they have the best tools to do their job. And this sort of mental image that I think about a lot is like a great craftsman or a great artist. And like when they come in to build something, they want to feel like the tools they're using are the best in the industry to produce the most amazing piece of art or product that they love. And I think for the heart of it for me has been sort of how do you enable those artists to really express themselves in a meaningful way.
Right. That is so interesting that you are talking about it in the context of of the last 20 years, because really I think in sort of the public space, uh, developers productivity is really a term that I think started to be really, really popular. I mean, it always was a thing, right? Some
Hmm.
companies cared about it, but in a wider world, I think it's like maybe last 5 7 years that it really gained some popularity, and it started to be perceived as important. Widely speaking, obviously, when we talk about big
Yeah,
tech, it's a
I
different
think
thing.
that's. I think if you go back, and I'll go back into the early, 2000s. A lot of companies had this sort of function, but it was seen as sort of a competitive advantage, and sort of it was sort of like we don't talk about it. In fact, my time at Microsoft, a lot of what we built internally were all our own tools, our own systems. We actually kept them very secret, right? because it was sort of seen as this sort of special sauce of how to produce software and produce software at scale. And I think there was this sort of pivot point that happened maybe around 2007-ish, where you saw a lot of the newer companies like Google, Meta, they had started contributing a lot of these tools into open source
Hmm.
because there's sort of like you needed hundreds of engineers to compete with this. And so what they did, which I think is an interesting, which I think led to this sort of more awareness in the industry around the space, was they started sharing with each other, right, these open source tools to be more productive. But previously, they'd sort of been like, nobody talked about it. You
Hmm.
didn't hear about source control systems. Nobody even like, they were like, many companies had their own custom source systems that they built, or they were enterprise products that they purchased and then modified. It's really this sort of rise of open source that led to this sort of big companies sharing with each other that created an even bigger community around it. And then it became like, well, how do I have the same, develop productivity that Meta has or Google has? And so it led to all these smaller companies starting to build out more and more of a department to do this. So it's been sort of a spectrum. I think your point is right. It's always been there,
Hmm.
but most companies just didn't think, oh, they didn't think they had the resources to fund it. Once code became more available through the sort of rise of GitHub and the availability of these systems and tools, and then desire for people to share these practices more broadly, you saw sort of a acceleration of it. And
Right.
I think that's the trend you're mapping to, at least from my experience. And for a lot of people who work in this space have been working in it for a long, long time, right? And but then you realize that like a lot of them aren't even known. I used to give this notion that a lot of the people who work in this space are sort of like Scotty or LaForge in Star Trek. They're in the engine room, no one knows them, but they're critical
Hmm.
to making these companies successful. And because of that, there was a lot of desire to sort of keep them out of the spotlight for many, many years. Because it's like you don't want people knowing that
Right.
you have all these competitive advantages. But it's the rise of open source that really created this,
Hmm.
sort of awareness that, oh, you know what, if I use this source system, can increase my productivity by X, or if I move to a new build system, I can reduce my build times by X or Y. I think that's sort of matches to the trend. If that
Yeah. And I sort of remember part of it because we started one of those first conferences, at least in Poland, and I think, you know, pretty much to some extent in Europe about developers' productivity, or we called it development tooling back then. It might have been 2014 or something like that. And I remember it was very niche. Like we had people from all over the world that were coming and saying, "Yeah, finally the conference about this particular
Mm,
topic." And today you go anywhere. And it's probably in San Francisco. You've got like few of those conferences every year about a single topic. So yeah, I mean, like you are right that it is becoming very very popular today. Now you talked about these in general about what it is, what what contributes to overall the developer's experience. Could you give us some of the examples, perhaps those that were the most challenging one or the most interesting ones from your time at LinkedIn related to the developer experience, the things that you worked on? Because we talked about it holistically, but there are certain
yeah,
bits and pieces, like maybe these are flaky tests, or maybe these are, I don't know, long test cycles or things like that, or lack of the integration. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about the concrete examples.
yeah. I think one thing you have to kind of really think about when you think about this space is that it's very easy when you run a company to treat developers as one type of person, right? And the reality is that there are very distinct groups or tribes or groups of engineers. And when I started in the industry, there was sort of that business developer, there were these systems developers, there were very, what you I think often happens is it's very easy to think of this as one unit of people, right? The developers, right? But the way a systems engineer works versus someone who's a front end engineer or an infra, like they're very diverse. The tool chains they use, the technologies they use are very different. The things they care about are very different. And and you start to see there's also this aspect of, I'll call it religion. There's people who have very strong opinions on you know, oh, I only want to use the terminal, right? I only use the terminal. UIs are horrible. I'll never use it. I think one of the biggest challenges in this space is when you build tools, you can't just build them for one customer. You actually have to have built systems that work for a very diverse market, right? And you have to find ways to sort of lift all boats. So when you do some of these improvements, you have to think about well, a Java engineer is going to work very, very different than someone who's working in Rust, right? Or someone who's working on front end using, Next.js. It's a radically different set of experiences, tool chains. So there's an incredibly diverse market space, and you have to think about how do you serve all of them, but also how do you make features that delight, those particular pockets. And then there's this sort of aspect of choice that really, I think, is really hard for, because when you work at a company, we want to, there's this tendency to let's just have one tool for everything, and you
Hmm.
use editors as an example. You go in a company and say, we're just going to use Cursor as our tool. And then you discover that you have half your employees who want to use NeoBim, and they're super angry because you're making them use Cursor as their editor. And there's honestly isn't a right answer there. So it becomes a really challenging thing to think about because generally extensibility is the enemy of consistency, right? Because
Hmm.
you end up having to build all these extension points that let people use different tool chains, and then suddenly you now have a huge giant level of differences. And then what ends up happening is you start to see pockets of people using different tool chains, building different systems that work great for them. And then they want to project that out to everybody else, like, well, everyone should just work the way I work, right? So it's a very challenging space. When you think about when you build a product for a consumer, you have one persona, you identify them, you build it that way. When you work in this space, you have to think about I'm going to have customers who work, all only want to work in NeoVim, and then there's customers who are going to want to work only in Cursor, and then there's a whole other set of dimensions of that when you start getting into compilers and deployment tools and cloud, and every dimension is sort of another exponent of change that happens, and it gets really complicated. And so I think when I think about the challenges in the space, it's like, how do you build a system that services, N people who have, M different styles, approaches, without sacrificing consistency becomes incredibly hard. And so I think that
Hmm.
in my hand is sort of the core challenge is, and the thing that people who are successful in the space is they find ways to build systems that are sort of at their core, but allow for this extensibility without sacrificing that consistency.
It is somewhat interesting, like from the perspective of the industry, and I'm talking about this or the profession, software engineering profession. You said about it's almost artisanal, like you have various people preferring various tools, and they are almost religious about certain tools
Hmm.
approaches. Like I'm trying to think about it, but it's like it seems to me that it's not something that you would find if you went to finance or to, I don't know, to architects. I mean, like building architects.
Or just engineers, just normal
Or
engineers outside
yeah,
of software. There isn't 16 ways to build a bridge,
yeah,
right? You don't have, they're like tried and true methods that have existed for hundreds of years. There's, mathematical formulas for correctness. There's sort of practices that have built up over time. And, I used to think a lot of it was because software was in its infancy
hmm,
and it was as a discipline. And the longer I've been in the industry, the more I've realized that, we're really, software engineers are really artists. They're less than they are engineers in the typical sense,
yeah,
right? They're really artistic. And, that aspect is sort of unique as a discipline, right? Because you're harnessing people's creativity to express what's in their head and to create something, right? And because you don't want to put bounds on that because it's sort of an unbounded art. You have to find new ways to approach it. So it's very unique in that way. And you're right. It's not like other industries. They're like you wouldn't go into an accounting shop and be like, I've come
Yeah.
up with a new way to calculate revenue, or I've come up with a new way. Like, but literally that happens. People come up with new
Yeah.
algorithms, right? And of course, there's some standards that have existed from the days of Dijkstra and Knuth. But even those, there's been recent improvements on Dijkstra's algorithms. People come up with new ideas, new approaches, and they fundamentally change, how we think about things. And I think that creative part, that creative aspect, is what's driven the industry forward. But it's also what held us back,
Hmm.
right? It's like because of that lack of discipline or rigor, and so it's all this sort of unique balancing act that I think we find a lot. And my thought has been always to lean into like how do we let people express themselves in like how do you enable people to really work the way they want to work, not
Hmm.
the way they want to work. And that's really the hard part is like when you build these kind of things, we all come with our biases, we all come with our own ways of working. Like I'm a systems programmer. I have a very hard time putting myself in the shoes of a UI developer and being like, yeah, I really think that color is super important and this color isn't super good. But for some people, that's the magic. That's the part that's
Yeah.
super exciting for them is picking the right shade of turquoise for a UI and having the controls lay out. And you have to kind of like think about like how do you let go of your own sort of like background and biases so that you can enable others and try to put yourself in their shoes and really what they love, because it's really about delighting them, making them feel like they can truly express what they're trying to create. If that resonates with you, I think it is this artist aspect, right? It's like what format do they want to work in? If you look at the art world, you have people who really like working in clay, people who really like working in
Hmm.
oils, people who like working with computers to generate art. And it's more similar to that in many ways than sort of the standard engineering, which is like, hey, we build a bridge or we build a train. There aren't a lot of ways to do it. There's pretty standard technologies, there's standard, approaches. Software is just very much more open-ended.
But is it because you sort of, I think you hinted in both of these reasons. One of that is the sort of the nature that it's a little bit different, but the other is the maturity of the field. You think it might be related to the maturity of the field?
I've gone back and forth on it. For a long time, I thought it was the maturity part, but like every, I don't know, every few years, there's a whole new set of like dimensions that pop, like whether it be cloud engineering, whether it be,
Hmm.
you know, like there's a whole new language, there's a whole new set of tools that exist. And I don't know, it could be maturity, but I also think the fact that the field hasn't reached standard model for deployment, like a standard model for building software, just isn't there, right?
Hmm.
And every time you go to a company, they're often using different tech stacks, different languages, different approaches.
Yeah.
Is that a maturity thing, like, or is it just that there just isn't one answer, right?
Yeah.
Like whether you build, if you're a Java shop and you decided to use Java, now you could say like what's the best language? And if you ask me that question, it's what are you trying to do, right? And so I don't think, and maybe this will change in the world of AI because we'll sort of abstract away from how we build things more. But even in then, the AI is sort of figuring out which tool chain is best for me to build this solution, right? I think it comes down to like there's still a lot of variability of like how to build a good solution. Some things are better. There's a lot of choices to make. There's n degrees of freedom, and because I think you're almost constructing your own world inside a computer when you're building software, and like you know the limitless and the unboundedness requires different tools for different things,
Hmm.
right? And I really do think it's more of a artistic thing, is that some things are just always going to be better for certain tasks and other things are better for others. And in that world where you have that level of difference, there's always going to be this level of a lack of conformity, right? Because what we desire is get to this sort of like, hey, there's only one way to build software, right? And as the industry has matured, it's only,
Yeah.
multiplied. It hasn't decreased.
Yeah.
Like if I go back to, the 80s, most people wrote in C or wrote in a high level language. There are only a couple ways to do things. It's actually the opposite of what happened. It's actually, we've seen this sort of multiplication of all these different approaches have actually increased, not decreased.
Yeah.
So if it was a maturity thing, we'd see some convergence towards some commonality, right? We're actually seeing the opposite from my perspective. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It could be. We could, we fast forward 100 years, maybe that will happen. But so far, the pattern is they're not. One language hasn't risen up as this is the way I write everything, right? Or this is the right tool chain to build everything. You do see some of that, but
Yeah.
it also, even those, they live for a while and then they get deposed by some other new technology that's radically different.
Yeah. I think that these it might be related to the number of layers that we have and the levels of abstractions. I think people argued at even around 2000 about whether you should be using GC garbage collection and virtual machines with garbage collection because it's inefficient. It may be something that makes you less of a programmer for whatever it means. And I mean, like these conversations are pretty much over these days. People don't argue about that anymore. And I think, like, my impression is you are right that the number of, options is increasing. But then
Hmm.
again, I see the speed of this increase also varying in time. It's like, I think in 2010, 2020, we had plenty of new languages. Like there was like Scala, Kotlin, Rust, Golang, all those languages that became popular after a few years. And I think that people have actually converged on some of them. And my impression is, like, sure, it's a subjective opinion, but my impression is that these today obviously the focus and this novelty and the development went into AI, right? It sucks all the air in the room, but even before that, I think it moved a little bit to different areas. Maybe how people run things, maybe whether they
Hmm.
deploy it in Kubernetes or somewhere else, maybe serverless or something like that. I think they stopped arguing about the language. They moved to argue about other pieces of the tool chain.
Hmm. I guess in the fullness of time, what I've seen is that argument just keeps coming back.
Right.
Like what you describe with garbage collection, I can go back to the days of VB versus Empower Builder versus C, right? And I think the argument is more a philosophical thing at a deeper level, right? And what it is this core argument, which is how much should the user be aware of what's going on, who's building the software, versus the system take care of things. And garbage collection, I think, is just another sort of example of that problem. There was this whole notion of like, well, the engineer who's building some software shouldn't have to know how the operating system works in order for them to build great software. And I think many people have taken a run with different types of languages to create greater and greater abstractions to prevent that sort of like cognitive load on the engineer to think about it. Now, there's sort of two factions in the industry. There's this sort of faction which is you should know how everything's working all the time so you can build great software. And there's people like, why would you have to ever think about that? And that argument is timeless. It keeps
Yeah.
coming back over and over. You can see it repeated in the same AI space where there's people like, oh, you shouldn't trust any of the AI stuff. You should know exactly what the code. And then there's other people saying you should just vibe code everything and let the AI will just get good enough at some point to figure it out. And you can see even patterns. There was a point in time where we used to talk about for C, there was a strong belief that you always want to, after you compile C into assembly, you would hand optimize the assembly to be maximize the efficiency and speed and memory usage, right? Because we didn't trust the compiler, 20 years ago to produce really efficient code. What's fascinating though is that like that argument was eventually lost. The compilers got good enough to really optimize, and no human being could ever optimize code. So that argument still keeps popping up. Like it's the same core argument.
Right.
It just has different versions of it that seem to rear its head in different ways. I think garbage collection is just another example. It's like, oh, why is the user thinking about it? And then we get to this place where, hey, the memory usage is really inefficient. The garbage collection is not working really well. You should move to Rust or another language where you're explicitly, denoting how it should be. And I don't think it's a settled argument. I
Hmm.
think it just keeps popping up in different ways. And it
Right.
just comes down to really how much should the person who's building the software understand the system that they're building on top of. And I don't think it's settled. I think
Yeah.
it's going to be many decades before, that answer will have it. And I think it's also because as the technologies improve, we create new versions of this problem, right? And we I think there's at the core though, there's this desire for people to be able to express their ideas in the most efficient way possible, right? And I think there's just two philosophical paths. There's one where it's like I should just focus on expressing what I want to build, right? And then there's another set of people who are like you should be very explicit about how this thing is going to work, right? And I don't have an answer to that. I think it's
Yeah.
it's just an argument that just keeps popping up in new ways. And the reality is this is what makes develop productivity so hard is that there are fundamentally engineers out there who will say, if you don't know how your memory is being managed and you don't know what's going on in the OS, you're not really an engineer. And then there's other people like, why would I even spend my time thinking about that? I'm just trying to build a UI for a customer, right? And I think that it's like almost a human thing. It's like a philosophical thing. And we keep optimizing. Different people keep coming and optimizing both sides of that equation. And so for a while, one gets better and the other one gets worse, and then someone else comes and optimizes the other side, and then we back to the same arguments, right? So I think these are some ways timeless arguments that are not going to be settled anytime soon.
But at least, as you say, they are popping out up in a different form, in a
Oh
way.
yeah.
Like, so it's like the history is, history rhymes, doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Mhm.
So that would be, that would be something like that. And maybe the part of it is also related to what you're building, right? I sort of understand. Like, my impression is that you are building something that really requires, significant or, very high performance, or it needs to be very, very integrated, streamlined experience. Maybe that's one of the reasons why you need to have some sort of this mechanical sympathy. And it's in a way the same, like there are this I think that similar argument is in the organizations and generally how they build, for instance, supply chain. Some of them would like to integrate vertically, some others would like to have this horizontal integration, and the argument is sort of similar, that if you want to make this peak experience for whatever you are doing, you got to control the entire chain. And in software it would be like all this mechanical sympathy, understanding how things work from very top to very bottom, right? And then again, if you are building an online shop, not necessarily in the scale of Amazon, but a regular online shop with a decent amount of customers, but maybe not necessarily being
Yeah.
handling everyone in the entire world. Maybe you don't have to.
Yeah, I would distill it down to sort of two dimensions that I think are interesting that kind of relate back to what you're saying, which is that there's always sort of been these sort of two archetypes that exist. There's a set of people who come to software looking to solve a customer problem. And they look to it with like, hey, I'm gonna build a shop. And many of those folks don't often care how they do it. They're just trying to solve the problem. They're really trying to catch the fish. And then there's a whole other dimension of engineering, which I'll call people who are sort of platform engineers who build capabilities. They're more focused on building the net to catch, and they really are focused on how do I build a better net? How do I build all this capability? But they really don't care in some cases when you talk to these folks about like, is the customer's problem solved? Right? Which is, I know sounds crazy, but there's just like sort of tug of war between those two perspectives, right? And you'll see this very much in engineer mindsets. There's the engineer you come with, well, I got to rewrite all this code because it's not efficient. And you're, what customer problem are you solving? And they don't have an answer because there's really no customer problem they're solving, right? Um, or I need to move from one transport technology to another because, oh, that one's really slow. Meanwhile, they can't point to an actual customer issue. And like I feel like that's the core of what this is that there's just different mindsets. There are
Right.
people who come to it with like, I want to create a set of capabilities or platforms that allow people to do other things with what I'm building. And there's some people like, I'm just here to solve a problem for a person. I'm going to make a problem go away. And what we see played out over and over is sort of the friction between those two mindsets, in all these things. And we'll see tool chains that are built up for one or the other that really focus on really empowering people to sort of solve for customers. You use a lot of these, what you see going on in vibe coding is that like, hey, it makes it super easy to solve a problem, but you didn't think about all these other things, right? And then you take it to like, and I talk to a lot of CPOs these days who are like, because they can vibe code now, many of them weren't, you know, deep engineers. They can build a feature in a day, and then they go to their engineering team and they're like, "Oh, it's going to take us 2 years to deploy this." And the CPO's like, "What? What? How could it take 2 years to
Yeah.
take what I've already got working?" And so, but that engineer is thinking about, well, it doesn't do this, it's not efficient, and
Yeah.
this is all these things. And not necessarily say that that group is wrong, but it's about what they value and what's important to them. And what's important to them is efficiency and effectively using machines. And both of these perspectives have value, but you have to see them sort of as like an overlapping set of things, right?
Hmm.
And I think it's very easy to sort of, especially depending on where your company's at. In the early days, you overweigh on the sort of solving customer problems. As you scale, you become way more focused on like, is this efficient? Are we effectively using our resources? Are we managing our costs efficiently, right? Because every dollar, makes a huge difference. Not that it doesn't when you're smaller, but when you're smaller, you're willing to burn to get the customers and create
Yeah.
revenue, right? But it really is this sort of battle between efficiency and solving problems, right? And I think there's validity in both perspectives. It's just something that we have to kind of be mindful of. People are often very biased by one or the other in how they approach software, and it very much weights in how they build software, how they think about problems. And you'll see this in people. Like this is why there are product people and engineers in some ways. It's like
Hmm.
there are people who are really focused on what I'm building for a customer, and there's people who are really focused on how do I build it really well and craft it really well and make sure it has all the most efficient usage of memory and CPU and networking, right? But that pattern plays out over and over and over again in the industry.
It's a great mental model. Like when you said that, and I really, it's sort of, I saw it in my mind, various people that really, fit into one or the other category of engineer working more on a tooling or, some infrastructure, and then someone who is more, you know, oriented toward product. And I think some companies even sort of appreciate it explicitly. I think Facebook Meta has those, they'll have those archetypes of engineers. And I believe one of those archetypes is product engineer, someone who
Mhm.
is closer to the product, but is still an engineer. And then you have other types, someone who is very good at, maybe fixing very, complicated, convoluted bugs and can spend 3 weeks chasing something in the infrastructure, which obviously at the end of the day is DNS because it's always DNS. But yeah, but these are, yeah, as you say, it's our different
It's in our
kinds of
DNA.
engineers. Yeah.
There's people who really love to focus on how do I build a better net, and there's people who are like, I just need to catch fish, right? They're
Yeah.
like, it's more deep rooted than just like these sort of like how companies work. It's fundamentally how people think. There's people who really focus on how do I solve my problem, and there's people who are really focused on like how do I, solve this problem for more people. And when you sort of think about it that way, you start to realize like people's behaviors really rooted in, their sort of inherent value system, right? And I think at the core, that's what's going on. And you see a lot of it play out scale across open source, across companies. You see this tension, and you'll see companies that are product driven. You'll see companies that are, well, I'll call them infra driven or engineering driven, and
Hmm.
their culture revolves around what they value. A lot of this, so they'll see. a lot of who they promote, who becomes, important, is echoed in the leadership thinking. Well, I really value solving problems for customers. Oh no, I really value great engineering. Right? And so you can see this sort of balance. And I think ultimately you look to try and create a good balance between those two things. But you'll see that DNA of human beings slip into the company culture, the what the tools they use, the systems they
Hmm.
pick, right? And I honestly don't know. This is one thing. It's like I think people are always like, which is better, right? And the answer is
Right.
neither, right? It's sort of like this, like each one has pros and cons, and that's why a lot of these philosophical arguments that end up in software, there really isn't a good or bad. There are pros and cons to both approaches, right? And so the idea is to figure out how you get the best from each world, whatever you're building, and how do you make sure you're using the right mindset at the right time.
Hmm.
And I think ultimately great companies are able to sort of really put on that the right hat at the right time and really focus on, like, sometimes it is about like, hey, let's make sure this is super efficient, right? If you've got 100 million customers and they're hitting all sorts of scale issues, engineering is probably the focus. If you've got five customers and you're trying to get to a million, figuring out how you
Hmm.
solve a customer problem is really important, right? Or if your customers are really angry with your product and they're leaving it in droves, right?
Hmm.
Even though you have 100 million, what problem is your product solving for those customers, right? So it is this constant balancing act. And this is also
Hmm.
why I think in software you see this rise and fall of companies. Is often I think they're putting on the wrong hat at the wrong time, right? They're like, hey, we really need to build up a better engineering and solve this engineering problem. And they're not listening to the customers, right? And vice versa. You'll see this sort of inverse of that in other places. And so I think it's about like balance. It's about like
Yeah.
picking the right approach at the right time. And it's a framework that I kind of think about a lot. It's like, you got to be thinking, how do you balance these like long term, you know, structure, discipline, rigor around engineering with how do I acquire customers in a quick fashion, really solve problems for them that resonate with them. But like you've got to be able to sort of do both, but really understand the people you're working with, the tools they're working with, and the tools also sort of push people down a path, right? If you set up a company and you do everything with vibe coding, you better be clear that your engineering might be questionable when you get to a certain scale. And so, are you thinking about that? Are you thinking about how you're going to deal with that, right? And I think it's way too easy now to sort of not think about it in the early
Hmm.
days, and I can point to things in, Windows and things that I worked on where we knew engineering was wrong, right? And we knew we should fix it, but we were really focused on getting features to customers at a certain point, right? And we didn't do the engineering work that would really allow us to scale for the long term, right? But we made a choice, maybe the right choice in the moment, right? But it's about having that sort of balance between those two perspectives.
Yeah, I mean that sounds very true because, like, I think if you think about that, everyone could point to some companies in the same field that on the surface has, one would subscribe to these engineering led type of organization line of thinking, and the other would be
Mhm.
more product, sort of led organization, and yet they may be both, equally successful. And it might be, I should say, it's more about this juggling and about this balance rather than, the general theme or the general direction.
So it's
Yeah.
about picking the right thing at the right time, and like I don't know. It's like this is the hard part of this kind of dev productivity jobs is you end up having to oscillate between these two perspectives, right? To really be, to live for the long term, to outlast, you have to be able to build systems that allow people to pivot very hard in some directions, because, one of the things that you hear at, the larger companies is they're really focused on how fast they can get a feature to a customer, right? Because they're really focused on getting stuff
Mm-hmm.
out. And then there's another set of mindsets. We really need to make sure about quality and stability, and those two principles are often in conflict,
Yeah.
right. It's this like, yeah, I can get things out faster, and so we've evolved. There's strategies around experimentation now that have come out of like, how do you balance those two things? But it's still a battle. It's still an unsolved problem at its core of like, there are these very deeply different approaches. And, I think people want it all. They want both.
Hmm.
But the truth is you often have to trade off, right? And it's
Yeah.
very hard in the current climate to figure out how to do those trade-offs because a lot of it's unseen. You make a decision, today without the full optics of understanding what it means 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And then suddenly you've created a problem for yourself that you can't, get yourself out of because you've got 10 more years of work to make it, to do the engineering work or vice versa. Hey, I've got some great engineering, but I don't have the ability to deliver to customers, at the speed I want. I mean, I've talked to like a ton, and some of it's also industry. Like if you're a bank, right, and you want to build some really cool new feature that uses AI, right, the restrictive policies they have from privacy, from, financial data, you can't just like say, hey, I'm going to go unleash a feature on 500,000 Fidelity's customers that's going to randomly buy stocks for them, right? Because one, if it doesn't work, right, you're going to have a real problem, right?
Hmm.
So there's these like where the company is at, and there's also the environment they exist in, the
Sure.
regulatory environment they exist in. So it's a balancing act, and I think the hardest part about these jobs is sort of like how do you do that balancing act? How do you enable both aspects of that without sacrificing something? And that's where I think a lot of I think in recent years a lot of this notion of measuring things that I spearheaded at LinkedIn and Microsoft of like really became sort of creating clarity of where are we, where do we have the right capabilities, where don't we? Because for the longest time we didn't know. Like you would know how long does it take for a feature to go to a customer was like an unanswered question in most places if you go back 10 years. Now, of course, there's lots of metrics and stuff people can point to, but they didn't exist 10 years ago, and which is crazy if you think about it. Like we'd have like thousands of people working on a feature, and we literally
Hmm.
didn't know how long it would take to go from a idea to delivery. Can you imagine if
Yeah.
you're a car company and you could not tell me how long it was going to take to go from a design to a customer? Like like that's that's so unique in so many ways. And look, the industry's gotten better at it, but I still think we don't really know. I still think we
Yeah.
don't really, you
I don't think we
know,
know. We know for the things that we know, like that we did several times. But if we look, for instance, for that, it's I think Apple is notorious of that. Is like when they release a new thing, it often takes many many years, like before they release.
it's interesting you bring up Apple because like you know what I think about we for a long time I was part of core Windows and I worked on a lot of that stuff and we had this desire to release twice a year to release an OS update twice a year, right? And coming off the decades of an OS every 5 years,
Yeah,
right? And it was interesting because we got to a place where we were doing every 2 years, and I think we decided, the market couldn't consume like an OS every twice a year, right? So in Apple, we looked at Apple and they were actually doing once a year releases for their OS,
yeah,
and we're like, that's probably the right like spot for an OS release because it's interesting that people have this perspective. Like me working on operating systems, I saw the opposite. If you release an operating system too frequently, you know, people can't consume it. They can't use it. It's and you're literally changing their entire experience. Right.
yeah,
You think about like when there's a small issue or even a big issue from some perspective in one OS release from Apple, people freak out, man. Like the number of people talking about glass and how they hate it and all this other stuff. Imagine they had a new UI every other month.
yeah,
Like so there's this sort of a weird aspect of it too, which is like, can your market consume these things? And and I think about this. This is the calculus we don't understand really. It's we don't because we haven't been predicted. We can't tell you it's going to take a year or 2 years. We don't know what's digestible. And then there's this whole other aspect of the OS is really complicated because it's where the software meets the hardware, right? And the hardware market doesn't move at the same pace as the software market, which is also interesting. So often the software is ahead of the hardware, and the hardware can't keep the same pace. You can build a bunch of software features in a quarter of the time it takes you to build the actual hardware. But if you release an OS and you don't have, like, let's use Apple as an example here. If they release their new fancy OS and now it runs really slow on the latest iPhone, you have to make it go with another release of the iPhone that's faster and more efficient so
Yeah.
that you feel like you're getting an upgrade, right? So it's kind of a tricky space, and it's really difficult to think about a lot. I think that, you know, um, I don't envy Apple because I think a year is also really crazy. 2 times a year was insane.
Yeah.
Like once a year is actually really, really rough. Because you're gonna they're building a new chip, they're building new hardware, they're building a new form factor, and they're gonna release that with a completely new OS, right? Every year.
Yeah, you are right. It's a more complex it's a more complex picture. I think people mostly see many of those updates as being incremental, irrespective of what is the technical complexities behind it, right?
Hmm.
It's like once in a while there is a, like, I think the recent years, the one of the revolutions might have been these glass thing in the new iOS, which people immediately noticed with various reactions to it.
But think about
But
that. They basically changed people's experience. Whether
yeah,
it's good or bad is a perception thing, right? But it's the fact that they changed something that people have grown accustomed to, right?
yeah,
You can point to, like, it's very hard for you to change, like, think about Tesla. The guy gets rid
yeah,
of turn signals and people freak out,
yeah,
right? So there's this really hard part of, like, things that people become accustomed to. You can't really change. It's actually really hard to change them, right?
yeah.
And so this is where software is really challenging, is that you have to do changes in a way that people feel like they're better, because it's very easy to lose your customer base by making a change that may be better, but
Hmm.
because you've got something they've already lived and worked a certain way, they become very accustomed to it. And it's the same with developer productivity. Like engineers become very, worn down a path of, like, I really like using the tools. And I think the resistance to AI adoption is a very similar thing. And there's tons of
Yeah.
engineers out there who are like, I will never use these AI tools. They're all junk. Half of them have never used them, to be fair. Okay? And the reason why they're so resistant is just they have this one path that they know works, right? And they become very, habitualized to using it. And the second you come up with a disruptive thing, it's always met with, like, fear and disruption and chaos and, like, and I think, if anything, when I think about the dev prod space, this is the challenge for most people building, AI products in the dev space, is that you've got to find a way to bring people onto these technologies without making it feel like you've fundamentally, changed the tablecloth on the table, right?
Yeah.
With, because they see the disruption, right? It has to feel natural, right? And I think these are the challenges of really changing the dev tooling, right? Is because once someone gets used to, like, hey, I do this to build, I do this to test, I do this. The second you come in and say you don't need to do anything anymore, you just do this. Right? That part is the hardest part for engineers.
Hmm.
It's changing their workflow. It's changing their flow state, because they've mentally and emotionally connected with, this is success looks like me doing it this way. I've been able to do it this way for so long, and I'm very successful. And once you start messing with that, you're really not. It's not a logical conversation. It's emotional. It's, like,
Hmm.
very deeply
Hmm.
emotional. And so this is where I think, where Copilot for the longest time had a really hard time, engaging people early on, is that they fundamentally were asking people to disrupt their workflow and work a different way. And it wasn't until someone could show them a way that really connected with, like, this doesn't change anything. It's just an extension of what you're doing, right? So that's where I think, other approaches have really made people feel better about it.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, like, I wrote it down as a sort of the to have a note to come back to that, because certainly the current pace of AI development and the evolution slash level revolution that is happening, it certainly feels like that, like specifically like some sort of fatigue that is happening on the market. People adopting tools, and before they build anything into their infrastructure with those tools, there is a new tool, and it's not only that the new tool is marketed as being better, but it seems that every few months there is tool that is actually significantly better. So it's difficult to build
Hmm.
something lasting. But before we get into that, because we sort of circled back to this dev productivity again, and one thing that you mentioned about the initiatives that you spearheaded at LinkedIn, and one of those things that I wrote down was the iHub productivity analytics platform. And as a maybe sort of the two-part question. One part is, could you give us sort of the overview of what this platform was, and the other thing, since it's a analytic platform, what are the metrics that you were tracking and observing, which sort of to me indicate maybe what are the metrics that you perceive as important for development productivity.
Sure. Well, so um, I went to LinkedIn. They had a lot of metrics that were sort of scattered. They had a lot of things. And they had like, it was interesting, they would pull these reports like once a week, and then they would go and sort of look at the data. And, the first thing, a sort of, at least culture that I had kind of embraced from my time at Microsoft was this sort of notion of like, when you come into work every day, what do you look at to know that everything's going okay? What do you know, right? And when you're running these internal teams, and for me, what LinkedIn needed was sort of a dashboard for this internal, develop productivity team where we could actually go and say like, hey, is everything okay? And they had a lot of data, but it was scattered all over the place. And first was like, let's just pull it all into one place. Let's create a view. And nowadays you'll see, there's products in market like DX and others that do a lot of this stuff. Going back 6 years, 7 years ago, this wasn't like the nomenclature. I think, a lot of people have brought to the forefront things like Dora, and a lot of it stems from like, dev productivity is really hard to measure. It's really a complex measurement to your point about what do you measure, right? And we had at the time we had a couple of objective measures, and we had this big survey we would do every quarter. And the problem with this, the where the problem started is we get the survey data, and it was very hard to take action on because it didn't have correlations back with like what the problem was. So like you get, these surveys kind of are interesting because you get like you'll ask a very broad question of what do you think about this tool? And you get some people who say, I fucking hate that tool. And you're like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Like if you own that tool and I hate your product, it's like and you become very dismissive of it. And so there were two parts to sort of what we did. Is one, we wanted to create a set of metrics that would be consistent, that anyone could look at any time. We could have organizational, you could drop down anywhere in the organization and see, people's scores, both from the objective view, but also see the subjective. We also added this thing called real-time feedback, which was sort of key because what we wanted to do is measure sort of people's experience through, you can think of it like an Uber ride. You finish your Uber ride, you give it a score, but then we could actually map that experience to like if they gave us a two for the drive, essentially, we could say, well, what went wrong in that path, and we could do correlation. Because when we get the survey, it's kind of too late. Like it's 3 months, somebody had a bad experience, and experiences, if you have one bad experience, it dominates your perspective
Right.
for a very long time. And so we had to first, we sort of built this lower level thing, which is sort of real time feedback. And then we sort of took all these objective measures and then we correlated the scores of that we're getting from the survey. So we created this sort of holistic, we gave it sort of, we made up a score. We created the score out of thin air, which like basically gave us an index that would let us know, is this good or bad, right? As a way to sort of understanding how to look at it, right? Because the challenge with dev productivity is there's like 80 numbers to look at. And the question is like, you don't know if it's worth your time to go look at a specific aspect of it. And honestly, most engineers and engineering leaders don't want to spend their time thinking about like, is my build system working well or this? What they want to know is my team happy with things? And so we sort of composed this into one score from many different, artifacts and then created, and then, but then when they're able to look at it, they're able to say, okay, my team is getting a 50 versus an 80. right, on our overall score. I think we did, 1 to 5, like performance ratings.
Mm-hmm.
If my team's getting a 3 on, dev productivity, what's driving that? And then we're able to actually pull out the key metrics that were different than others and do comparisons. So you're able to see like, okay, your team is builds are way slower, right? And this is the other aspect of dev productivity that I think often goes unsaid is that you can have an awesome system, but if you put junk in it, right,
Mm-hmm.
you're still going to have a bad experience, right? So if I
Mm-hmm.
have a super fast build system, but I put in a bunch of sleeps in the build process, it's not going to be fast, right?
Yeah.
So you need to be able to have this sort of relative comparison too, and be able to give people a sort of a roadmap to say, okay, is this your problem? Is this an infrastructure problem? So we started to build sort of the view that let people look and drill into specific spots, and it allowed us as a team also separate things that were really deeply infrastructure problems, like versus cultural problems versus like technology choices by the feature team, right? Because one metric that people like to use is the time it takes to do a commit, right? Was one
Yeah.
metric that we had. We check, how long does it take from the PR to the actual commit gets approved. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of that's not technology, that's humans. Like humans
Sure.
making, do I have enough people on the PR? Do I have, there are other dimensions. Like, is this a huge PR? If I send you a 5,000 line PR, there's no way you're going to review it in a day, right? So we had to come up with a whole set of ways to think about that and really give people insights. So that's where I came from. iHub was Insights Hub, was really giving people these insights of, okay,
Mm-hmm.
you do realize that your team is checking in, 300 line PRs every week, and that's why you're different than everybody else, right? And that's why your team is frustrated. So you sort of have to be able to give the user an understanding of how they're using the tools and how they can use them more effectively, as well as taking a deep inventory of your own tools and what could be better, right? If you're not optimized for the larger commits, maybe there's something that's harder. Are you exposing it to enough people? Like, are you by default? So
Mm-hmm.
there's this sort of this balancing act, and what we really thought of was how do we capture all this insight that we have and democratize it back to the rest of the organization. And I think that was the real innovation with iHub for us, was really about sharing a lot of things that, like, in the past, what we had done is we'd have like, we'd assign like a engineering systems expert to go work with the team and partner with them and do all this. And really what that person did was figure out these metrics,
Mm-hmm.
understand where these gaps were, and then share that data, what they could do better to get a better use case or open bugs against us. And we're like, let's automate that. Let's make it a site that where you can go to at any point in time and see where you're standing, what the gaps are. Are there things you can do? Are there things we're working on to make it better? And really share that information very proactively
Mm-hmm.
versus like, it's like, oh, this shit doesn't work. I don't know what to do. Right.
Right.
And I have no way to make it better. Right. But if you go to a site and you can say, hey, I have 3 engineers, one of them is having a really crappy experience, a really bad experience, and it's because they're doing these things differently than the other two, right? And there were lots of like interesting insights we found. Sometimes people who were having the worst experience were working on legacy code. They were working on things that weren't being maintained, or they had old systems. Those were powerful things that change, and they,
Mm-hmm.
you know, exposing it to people in a way that's digestible was sort of one of the key aspects. It's not just about having the data, it's about making it sort of like digestible for people. So the iHub stuff was really about how do we present it in a way that starts from a simple thing that then you can drill in and find more details and then take action on. And
Right.
that's really important. And I think, the danger with these metrics is like a lot of people, I have the metrics. And like, one of the things I've seen a lot in this space is like people will come in and say, hey, we've got great build times. Everything's awesome. Or they have all these metrics and that everything says everything is awesome. And then you go talk to the engineers and like everything sucks. Right.
Yeah.
And how can that be? And it's because sometimes the objective measures may be the wrong measures. Sometimes they don't tell the story, the real story of how people are using it. And so there's this aspect of iHub that was really about marrying the subjective experience with the objective reality and really understanding where the gap was, right? And I always looked at the subjective parts, the survey scores, these sort of like,
Hmm.
real time experiences as sort of a catch all for what are we missing in these objective measures? What are we not capturing? Where is this friction, right? Because ultimately, what you're trying to do is remove friction for engineers. Like, they want to feel like they can come in and they can get features to a customer in a day, right, or an hour, or a minute, right, and really understanding where is that sort of friction in that experience for them, like both from what you see objectively, but also like where do they feel the friction is, and being able to then reflect back and say, okay, we're missing a measure here, we need to have some
Hmm.
sort of additional metric that captures this because we didn't see any of this. And I think if you think about it like a framework of, and sort of almost like a seesaw balancing act between the subjective, impression an engineer has and sort of the objective data. And you know what, the the way I would reflect on this is also with quality. When you think about what a customer thinks quality isn't just, hey, you hit some numbers, right? We forget there's this weird, not weird, but there's like an ephemeral aspect to quality that, like, people who love BMWs, for instance, they
Yeah.
can't even articulate why they think the BMW is quality, but they get in the car and there's this feeling, right? And it's not very objective. So you have to be able to capture that sort of emotion and but be able to correlate it back to why they have it. Like, okay, this person had a good experience. What were their numbers? This person had a bad experience. Was there any deviation in the numbers? What did they feel? Like, well, I felt all the materials were crappy in my car. They felt like plasticky. Well, that's the part you're trying to capture. You're trying to capture that emotion and further distill it down to what can we change and how do we articulate. And so iHub was a product that was meant to sort of take the objective and marry it with the subjective in a way
Hmm.
for us to correlate and do it more, more systematically than sort of one-offs. And it gave us a way to view the whole organization holistically and see where there were pockets and see why certain pockets. And the other aspect we did with that too that I didn't mention, which I think is important, is that we also really decomposed engineers into different personas. So front end engineers are different than back end engineers are different than this. And how you measure what they, if you're using a totally different stack, you'll see a different slice.
Hmm.
And so when we started to decompose everything and look at it like, well, the back end engineer on the team is super happy, but the front end engineer is miserable, right? That actually is an insight that really changes how you think about it, because maybe you're using a crappy web technology that's not the most innovative for them. Maybe they don't feel effective in the way they can do stuff. And so you have to think about it from multiple dimensions. But at the root of it was really about trying to take objective things, marry them, but then understand, how people worked and what were they doing in that space.
That's such a comprehensive answer. So, on the one hand side, I'm sort of blown away by the depth of the, you know, of your thinking that goes beyond behind this. But on the other, I'm sort of a little depressed because it's like there's no easy answers. There's no numbers. There are no, easy things. Everything depends, and there is always context. But yeah, I mean, like, and even what you said
Honestly,
about this,
that's every executive I've ever worked with is like always like, can you just give me one number to look at?
yeah,
And you're like, can we just have some way to make that product better? And it the most frustrating answer back is like, oh, it's there's nuance.
yeah,
And the thing I've realized in this space is people hate nuance. They just want a simple
yeah,
answer. So we tried to create that simple answer, to be honest. But the problem is it is a nuanced thing. It is very complicated. And that part is actually the part that makes people most frustrated, right? Is
yeah,
like it's that what you just said is the biggest frustration for people is why can't this just be simple,
yeah,
right? And you're hitting on the emotion that I think every executive I've ever worked with and peer of mine is like, can't this just be a simple thing, right? And I wish it was, but I think my insight with Inside Hub was like, we can make it simple for other people. We don't need to share all this complexity with them. How do we share it in a simple way that lets them understand it that way? And that's maybe the key innovation we had, which was like, how do we
right,
give people a simple thing to focus on? Not here are the 86 numbers you need to look at, right?
yeah. Because like I think that sort of everyone who've done anything that is relatively complicated. Understand that the nature of pretty much any physical phenomena is that if you collapse the number of dimensions, you're going to lose some information. Well, unless assuming that those dimensions are really had some value, and it's going to be that. So it's sort of grounded, but you'd expect that it's like the example with the quality. You'd expect that it's difficult to say that quality is 83 out of 100 because we don't know what that means. But at least you'd expect that maybe there are three, five, seven numbers that give me 70% of the information. So it's like, and there's gonna be some sort of a diminishing return after that.
There are, I mean, there are numbers. The thing that happens is that you find that they can be incredibly misleading, and I think that's the part that really leads to this chasm. So, door metrics, there's a lot of good metrics out there and frameworks that you can use to pull this together. What you see though is you start using those, and then if you become pedantic about it, you lose sight of what's really happening. And similar to quality, I'm going to tell you a good story about quality. In similarly how it relates is that we were working on Windows 10, and we had all these GPU tests, and the GPU test passed 99%, and we released an update to the industry, and then we saw massive failures. And we have 99% pass rate, right? Right. But then we release it to a larger population, we see massive failures. How can that be? Turns out that 1% was a big issue for a very popular video card that was out in the industry, right? So there's this dimension of it. It's very easy to overlook, these nuances and these pieces, and you really have to find ways to make your system like alive. It has to adapt, it has to grow and evolve, because especially as you scale engineering orgs, what was acceptable or okay when you had 50 people and they could all talk to each other, when you have 1,000 or 2,000 people, becomes untenable. Right? And so you have to build systems that live and breathe and grow, that actually can adapt and evolve and give you a more insight opinion of where the problem is, right? Because it's the same with quality and scale, right? It's like, yeah, when you're, a one-off issue that only hits 1% of the time is not a big deal when you have a certain population size using your product. But when you have millions or billions, it becomes a real problem, right? And so this
Yeah.
is the danger of statistics with a lot of these measurements and numbers, is that it's easy to forget that small population, and then understand that then that population can then become a predominant voice, and then they influence the whole set of people around you, right? So if you have five people who are pissed off, they go talk a lot more than the other 90% of people who are happy. Like,
Yeah.
your detractors are going to go run around saying, hey, this is a piece of crap, right? And so you have to really think about that. And part of these things is really about designing systems that are like organic, that grow and evolve as the tool chains change, as the company changes. And so that's what we tried to do with iHub, was really build something that was adaptive, that would evolve over time, right? And not create like stagnant, you know, view of what we thought was going on, because that's where the danger comes in. Is you pick seven metrics or four metrics, and you use that, and then you hit 100%. And there's this aspect of the Heisenberg principle. You start measuring, you optimize for the measure, but you actually are changing in some ways how you measure things. Like you're optimizing for the measurement sometimes, and you miss this other aspect. And so this is the part that's the danger with these sort of like perception based things. You have to balance them out so that they keep feeding and improving over time.
There is this Goodhart law, as far as if I remember correctly, right? You don't want to have this thing that the metric eventually becomes a target, right? Without
Hmm.
with forgetting what is the actual thing that you want to improve. Wow, that is that is so interesting. And like the one thing is that we are getting here, it's very nuanced field. But the other thing that is really interesting for me is it's not about showing the information. Well, first thing, giving the access to information or democratizing the information for the consumers of the platform. And also, it's not only about the information, but also about this information in the context of the other things that are happening, because that is sometimes what is missing.
Yep, that's
Right.
exactly it. It's you know like, the thing with a lot of these systems, perception sometimes matters more than the objective reality, right? And you have to factor that in because engineers are humans and not software, right? So even if you tell them, hey, you've got great numbers, they don't care if they have a crappy experience. That becomes the predominant thing, and you've got to be able to make sure your
Sure.
system is evolving with them, right? And this is part of what's going on with AI too, is it's making a lot of these metrics irrelevant. Like a lot of the what we used to use, I don't think matter anymore. Like, if you use CodeRabbit, the commit time is going to go to zero, right? Like, you have something that's automatically doing code reviews for you, right? How does that like? So there's a lot of changes that happen, and like if you're not adapting and evolving and understanding what people's problems are today, these metrics become a false sense of security, right? And so it's like, and it's very clear right now. Like the most commonly asked question that's in this space is like, well, we bought all this AI stuff. How much more productive our engineers are? And anyone who tells you they know the answer, I think, is lying, right? They don't really know, and they're trying to answer a question of like, how many engineers do we need to build software? And we've never answered that question
Yeah.
for the last many years, and now we're trying to answer this question, realizing it's a complicated question. It's complicated. It's hard, and nobody likes that. The CFO does not like that we spent $10 million on AI tooling, and he's not seeing a reduction in dev population or a reduction in engineering costs. He's seeing an increase, right? And so I think you hit on it. Is like these things are nuanced, and that's the rub. That's the thing that are really driving this friction and all this, sort of schizophrenia and what we do and how we approach things in the space is that there aren't answers. And I think it's also why it's the most exciting time to be in software is because basically it's a whole new frontier in many ways of redefining how we're going to think about this for the next 20, 30 years.
Talking about detractors in this vocal minority that you mentioned, part of development productivity, as you said, is this balance between the standardization and letting people use whatever they want. And I think in general, as an industry, we are going back and forth between that, like monoliths. Then we had Werner Vogels coming and saying, "You build, you run it, however you want it." Then we came with the idea, well, maybe it's not the most efficient way, and we figured out the platform engineering that might be a thing, but it's sort of one of those things is that you want to have some standardization. Not
Mm,
necessarily. I get it as you mentioned because it also, for me, is also related to what you said. It's not only one kind of engineers. I think managers in organizations tend to have this tendency that they want to standardize things and see everything as a sort of the one kind because from the sufficiently high level everything looks the same. But
mm,
uh, but there is some value in this standardization. And part of this value is a trade-off, right? You're gonna make some people that did things. We also covered that a little bit. That did things differently, and now you come with something to those people and say, look, now because we want to improve things, in the entire organization, you're gonna switch to something else. So they're gonna be the detractors. What are your first question is, have you stumbled into these opposition happening in the organization? And if so, from some teams that might have used something else in the past, some custom work.
yeah,
And
I
if
think
so,
it's,
how did you manage that?
yeah,
So
I'd
how did you
say,
generate buy-in? Maybe that's my
yeah,
question.
I think one, standardization is probably the most provocative thing you can do in an organization, depending on like, because like you said, this is a nuanced thing. And like, look, from a company perspective, it's usually like it's way more efficient to have one set of technology, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like very, ideal. But it's a sort of balancing act between what do you lose by, sort of cutting off innovation in certain dimensions, right? So I think partly the challenges that you run into in the space are like one, you know, you have to be clear on the out what you're trying to accomplish. I think oftentimes there's like, standardization for the sake of standardization is not a good thing, right? It's
Sure.
just like, hey, we're just gonna have a standard and blah blah blah. I think though, and what you'll see a lot of times is there's like, hey, I have this thing that's making me more efficient, and you lose something when you take away. I can think of we had check-in systems, that were all the rage at one point, and I remember looking around Windows, and I think there were like 15 different check-in systems, right, for different groups, right? And the reality is every group was subtly different.
Yeah.
And I've heard, I remember talking to Google a while back, and they had a similar, the search group has a set of technologies that are sort of standard, but each other business group has, subtly different things, and they built, massive investments in their engineering tools in each one of those divisions. So what's really hard is like more entrenched you are, right? It's hard to get back to one standard, right? Because if you've built a solution that works really well for a specific domain, it often is a bad idea to standardize. Um, but there's also the flip side of like you've lost something in the ability for people to work efficiently across organizations, groups, company, sort of boundaries. So I think like what I've experienced, it really has to be sort of the benefit outweighs sort of the cost, because I think we also wildly underestimate these kind of efforts to standardize.
Hmm.
People are like, oh yeah, we can just move to this on a Tuesday, and then
Yeah.
it's like 3 years later, and we're like, hey, we still haven't moved, a third of
Or
the cover.
yeah,
Yeah,
which is the
and
worst. We
and
moved part of it, like part of the organization. Now we have two systems.
and I think in my time, I went through a bunch of times where we were doing these sort of boil the ocean approaches, where we're like, we're going to rewrite all of the entire build system of a large project, right? We're going to redo it, and you know, there was lots of benefit in doing that, but the cost was so out of control to do that I think that cost far outseated. So one, I think you have to think about the migration cost up front. Like, what does it really take to migrate? What does it really take to get people on that same standard? And what's the outcome you're going to get? Like, what are the benefits that people are going to get? And when you're trying to get people to buy in, you have to sell them on the benefits first, and you have to mobilize them to be like, invested in making that happen. Because if you can do this mandate and push people to do it, and but I found that those efforts, they end up taking multi years. They end up, like, oh yeah, in 6 months we're going to deliver this thing, and every magic's going to happen, right? And the magic never happens. The magic is never ever happens. The wizard never shows up. He doesn't solve your problems. You end up at the end, and people are really unhappy because you just spent 3 years and a ton of people to get marginal improvements at best in many cases. So I
Or
think,
in the meantime, they are worse for some period of time.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so I think part of it's about when you do these things, you have to get enough buy-in from people that they can see the value. And if they can't see the value, you should start questioning yourself whether you should do it, right? Because if they're not motivated to do it on their own, you're not solving a problem for them. You're solving a problem for you,
Right.
right? And so I think there's this sort of, and this is one of the dangers of the kind of organizations I've been in, is it's very easy to become, myopic to the reality of like this person's going to have to live and breathe in this ecosystem. I might make it worse. I might make it, you know, bad for a certain period of time. Like, are they bought in? And the ones that I've done where there were massive standardization efforts, there was a generally the ones that were really successful. There was like a general like, yes, we want that, and we will help make that happen because it's going to make our lives better, and people could see the outcome. Like we moved LinkedIn to GitHub, and we got rid of. We had multiple source systems. Moved everyone to GitHub and single source. But generally, when we started having that conversation with our customers internally, it was like, yes, I want that. I want GitHub. I don't want to have to do these five different things and these different situations. So the momentum from the customer was there. The momentum, the idea was like, I can see the value. I'm willing to put skin in the game to help make this happen. And like, I think when you do those kind of things for standardization, there has to be a clear, value prop, right? And
Hmm.
I think it's very easy in these orgs to dictate, and often you stop listening to people who are like line level engineers who are like, well, I'm losing all these cool things that I have right now. And you know, in the kind of roles I'm in, it's very easy to ignore those folks and then go
Hmm.
down a really bad rabbit hole of like, I know better. And the
Yeah.
reality is often you don't know better. You just didn't understand the perspective that person was living, or their what they're experiencing. And that's why, I mean, this is kind of hard stuff. But I do think, like, I've done a bunch of really big standardization efforts, and the ones that were really successful, it was like when you showed up to talk about what you were going to standardize on, people were like, "Yes, let's do it," right? And then there were ones like, "What? What? Why are we doing this?" And if that's the reaction you get, and even if after you kind of walk them through what the upside and why we're changing is, they don't go, "Oh, I get it. I totally see why this is. I'm gonna put a bunch of resources to make this happen." If you don't have that reaction, there's something wrong with your plan, right? Because if you can't articulate to someone in a few minutes what the upside is for them, then you're just doing it for the sake of doing it, not actually
Yeah.
making something better, right?
Sometimes it is a case of, I guess, the higher level integration. You have certain pieces that are like people, as you said, people are accustomed to some things, and for some teams, the tools that are used, they are using these tools are better because they use it for some time and they are accustomed to it, right? They get used to it, and that's sort of the reason. That's this psychology that you mentioned earlier.
But I think that's part of it. But it's also that if you can't show them the better world and why it's better for them,
Mm-hmm.
you got to start questioning your plan, right? Because even if I've built, I mean, in all these places, people don't live in isolation. They live in an ecosystem and they have to collaborate with other people. And the goal of standardization isn't just to standardize, it's to make the working across organizational boundaries easier.
Mm-hmm.
It's to make this sort of challenges of working at scale easier. And in my mind, that has to be self-evident, right? It has to be really clear that, like, hey, you have all this friction here, here, and here. This is going to make it better, right? Um, and there's other benefits, like you'll go talk to people, and they're often maintaining, with six people, some custom implementation they have for some sort of engineering tool. Like, no engineering leader wants to do that. They don't want to spend that. So if you
Right.
can show them, like, hey, the benefits have to be clear. And I think it's oftentimes many of these teams, they act on mandate, right, versus on because this is the danger of being an internal focused organization, is you stop thinking like you're selling something to a customer.
Hmm.
Right? You start having this power of, like, I can tell
Right.
you what you're going to use, and like you know we used to talk about this NPS, which is a scoring system where
Yeah.
you say, would you recommend this to people? And I have this big opinion: never use NPS for internal tools, because you have a captive audience. So it's like, what does it mean to recommend these tools to others? You have to use, like, are you satisfied, right? But this is real, like, in that narrative, there's this really important aspect of, you have to recognize that when you're doing these dev productivity things, you have a captive audience. You're subjecting them to your will.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, if you do that over and over again, one, you're going to be wrong a bunch of times. And you have to know, the way you work is not the way that other people work. And if you don't allow for sort of like you to sort of have a bi-directional and think of them like customers, you end up in a world where you're mandating and dictating things, ultimately leads to a really bad experience.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you have to constantly be questioning, like why are people pushing back on this? Like, why do they not want to use this? Like, what people don't complain just for for fun, right? They're usually complaining because you're going to make their lives worse, right?
Yeah.
And you have to approach them as if it's like an external customer and you're actually trying to make a sale,
Yeah.
right? Because if you do it the other way, it's like, I mean, and you can get away with it. Like, plenty of places I've been,
Sure.
you can get away with telling, we're going to do it this way, right? But every time I've seen that happen, the story plays out really bad, because people end up being really unhappy and really frustrated, and they don't know how. And it's sort of, it's just a very common pattern, right? Why do we pick this technology? And you end up explaining, well, we picked this because of this and this. And if you find yourself in that rabbit hole, you have to start saying, well, did we pick the right thing? Are we really pushing the right, approach? We just, make people conform for the sake of conformity, right? Could we have some extensibility and allow for people to operate the way they want to operate without negatively impacting the larger ecosystem? I think those are questions you have to ask yourself. Right? I don't know if that resonates for you, but it's like it's definitely the danger of these jobs is that like I've decided cursor is the only way
Yeah,
people are going to use AI. Right? Is a very dangerous position to take right now.
yeah.
Right?
Especially
Um,
these days, yeah. But it sounds again so true because I think we tend to forget about this approach that you need to try to sell something instead of using these, operating on the mandate that you have, because there's always someone in the organization that has, even if not formally, at least informally, sufficiently strong position that they can oppose it for a very long time because
mhm.
it's more work, and we won't do something else in it because it usually is some work for the teams. They need to at least migrate some things, and even if there is no, because you mentioned that sometimes it's the danger is that the tool that the opposition is because the new tool on the new platform is worse. What is also the case sometimes is that like the new platform is different but not significantly better. It's just the same but different. And now we're gonna spend all this time to migrate to this for what? What is the benefit for us? There's no benefit. We'll spend some time, right? And that is also something that I stumbled upon many times in the past.
I think when you start thinking about it as customers, like you don't make every customer happy. You make
True.
your goal is to make as many happy as you can, and there's some that you just have to accept that they're not going to be happy with certain things. But I think if you take that approach, you end up like grounding yourself in a different type of reality. Like a lot of these efforts end up being like, well, we just need to do it, people ask questions. It's like, well, we just need to do it because we need to do it, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you can't articulate the benefits and you can't be open to hearing that difference of opinion, then your plan is really bad.
Yeah.
And I think this is the danger of many engineering orgs I've worked in where we do these mandates and the leadership can't articulate the benefits, right? Is like is just hubris. It's like and there's almost this oftentimes just talk to people, it's like I can see something that no one else can see. Like that's bullshit.
Yeah.
I like you're just not able to articulate the value in a meaningful way. And if you can't do that, then your plan probably needs to be rethought. And I think part of building really great dev productivity orgs is about being open to hearing that. Like being open to like creating the listening channels for you to be able to hear that from customers and really listen to your customers to help guide you with the right things that are doing. Of course, there's things that you're going to do that sometimes don't make all customers happy. But if you're pissing off 90% of your customers
Sure.
90% of the time, you don't have a business.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have to think about it that way. You have to think about those are the people that are paying your salaries, right? And you have to think about my goal is to make as many of them as happy as I possibly can. I think it changes your perspective a lot, right? And it's very easy though, I think, to lose sight of that. It becomes, you
Oh,
know,
definitely. And the goals sometimes are very vague. Like you, or the one thing is very vague, like very artificial. We wanted to move from, I don't know, AWS to Azure, for instance, because we want to, get rid of one of the cloud. And it's like the benefit is for whom? The benefit might be like it's artificial benefit. What happens if you have some, like sure there are some benefits if you have some services here, some services there, but it's the thing is that it's not always obvious and tangible benefit for the team that is affected. They were running on
mm,
AWS for a long period of time. It wasn't nothing wrong for them. It's just that the organization decided to move to the other cloud. So the team doesn't have any significant benefit. They just need to migrate. And they might need to migrate like third time, for instance, because the company decided already third time that we are jumping to yet another cloud because I don't know, the CTO has changed.
yeah.
And
I mean, I'm always big on insulating yourself. like sort of the sort of the the damage zone that you have from that kind of migration, right? I think this is the issue, is that the more you, and like, I think this is the, because someone went into cloud early on and just put stuff everywhere,
Mm.
right? And it's the same with engineering tools. It's like you get in there and it's like everything is like glued together with duct tape and bailey wire, right? And it's like it's hard to articulate, like we're not in a tenable place. But I think in many of those cases, there's ways to do it that are natural. For instance, moving to Kubernetes, making yourself not, you know, um, making yourself cloud agnostic in some ways over time versus like doing these hard pushes. And I think the way you approach it is really important. I think a lot of the other part of these standardization efforts, they happen in this sort of like, we need to do this by next Tuesday. So
Mm.
everyone needs to drop everything and let's do it, versus like, how do we build a model that teams can slowly over time, get to a better place, is also something to think about. Because, when you're an engineer in a team, you're often getting 16 different mandates from five different people, and like the taxes build up. And we don't think about how we do this in sort of controlled, you know, minimizing the sort of spray of how it affects everyone. And I think that's part of the problem. Like, if you want to move from one build system to another, right, you going out and saying everyone needs to rewrite their build systems in a year is not the right thing. It's like, okay, how do we make sure that we can do it automatically by minimizing the use of a certain pattern? Like, how do we sort of inject that initially, break this, and then slowly move people, and then you can move them separately? Because I think that it's kind of weird. It's like making your customers pay the cost
Right. Yeah.
of you making a decision for product decision. And I think that when you start to frame it from the way I was talking about, from a customer perspective, well, we've decided to make our customers do all these things before they can actually get to
Yeah.
the new product. I can think of recent OS releases from various companies where they're like, "Hey, you need to do all these things to move." And
Sure.
like,
It
what is
happens.
yeah, what a disaster though. Like from a
Yeah.
customer
Yeah.
perspective, they lose customers over it. They lose people and they disengage. And I think if you start thinking about like, how do we not expose that pain to a customer, or
Mm.
do it in a way where it just becomes sort of a gradual, it doesn't feel like you've changed anything,
Yeah.
is really the secret sauce to making those things reality. And I think most people don't think about it that way. I
Mm.
think they think about it like, because everyone works, there's sort of this like, well, all these people work in my team, I can just tell them what to do.
Yeah.
And, you know, organizations are fascinating. Once they get to a certain size, that's not a reality. Like I think, people have this like weird idea, and even executives who get to very high, they say, "Oh, we can just tell everyone to do this," and it's like, no, not really. Like you think you can, like maybe you can do it, but how come many of these cases it never works out that way?
Yeah.
Because people come with 60 different reasons what they hit, or issues, or pop up, and I think you have to start thinking about, like, if you think about them like customers, it sort of changes your perspective. You wouldn't do some of these things to a customer. Like you would never tell a customer, "Hey, I'm moving to AWS from Azure. So by the way, you need to move your account and do this." In fact, I think companies do that
Yeah.
really screw themselves, because of course there are cases, but think about how many times you've been like, "Oh, Google decided to change my account from an S to this." Like, why is that my problem? Why don't they just
Mhm.
take my account and migrate it for me, right? Like, why am I spending the work? Like, I'm paying the money. Like,
Yeah.
why should I pay the pain? So I think you have to think about it. If you think about it that way, I think it grounds you in a much better reality.
And this is where we wrap up part one of my conversation with Jared Green. Today we went into nuance of what developer productivity really means. In part two, we'll talk more about what AI is actually changing in developer productivity today, why most big organizations still struggle to see real gains, and how we could rethink maintenance, tooling, and day to day life of engineering teams. See you in a bit.